The last session is titled as Fantasy Sports, Facts and Fallacies, which is a presentation by Anwar Shirpurwala ji, who happens to be the CEO Federation of India Fantasy Sports. मैं चाहूँगा अनवर साहब का हम स्वागत करें मंच पे, and I would request the visual team to please prepare the presentation. Meanwhile, let me tell you, Anwar ji has over 20 years of cumulative experience is in business development and sales in government and private sector.
We need your presence.
As CEO of MATE from 2012 to 2019, he has been immensely contributing to the growth and development of the association and strived to create a vibrant ICT industry. He transitioned MATE into a proactive organization, creating value groups to effectively cater to the needs of industry. As CEO, since 2019, he is on a mission to create self-sustainable, first ever self-regulatory organization for the fantasy sports industry in India. His key role is to strategize and implement public policies for the development of the industry. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome for the last session of this evening, Shri Anwar Shirpurwala ji on stage. जोरदार ताली से उनका स्वागत किया जाए.
Anwar, is there an issue?
और अपना सीट मत छोड़िए. Okay, I would request. We were thinking that we'll do a presentation, but after a very emotional, sentimental, engrossing session, we thought that might as well we'll do a good conversation on what we are. And therefore, instead of doing presentation, what we will do is I will request my colleagues to come here. They are from. Let me welcome first Professor Ratnakar Shetty. Professor Shetty. If you play cricket and if you follow cricket, then you would know that Professor Ratnakar Shetty is one of the longest serving administrator of BCCI. He's been the general manager of BCCI, and he's also an advisor to the Federation of Indian Fantasy Sports. I'll talk to you about what that is. Also, I'd like to welcome Mr. Dinkar Vashish. He's the Vice President of a company called as Games 24/7. They have a fantasy sports app called as My 11 Circle, one of the very popular fantasy sports app. So the idea of being here is today to tell you what fantasy sports is, and ये वो fantasies नहीं जो आप सोच रहे हो. This is different. This is fantasy sports. This means that this is something which is virtually played. And it is played only when a real life game happens. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'll go and take the seat and we'll do a conversation on this. Yes, thank you. So, I'll give you a very quick brief of what fantasy sports is, and then possibly we'll get into the conversation that we want to do. So what happens is that as a sport fan, आप जो भी sport में आप interest रखते हो, whether it is cricket, football, hockey, whatever sport it is, you always have an expert view. Okay, आपको पता होता है कौन सा player कब कहाँ कैसे खेलना चाहिए to win the match, right? And that is what the fantasy sports app actually bring out that talent of yours. So what it allows you to do is create your own teams with your skill and knowledge. Because if you don't know the game, obviously you cannot create that that sort of a team for yourself. So it's an online app. It can be played on a mobile or it can be played on a desktop computer. Popularly, it is played on a mobile app. What you have to do is, before any real life match happens or starts, you go and create a team of those players which are actually going to play a match. So let's take an example. IPL aa raha hai. Assume that the first match is between Mumbai and Delhi. Okay, so Mumbai will have 11 players and Delhi will have 11 players. We call it as playing 11 होता है ना, उसको playing 11 कहा जाता है. So from that 11 and 11, 22 players, you actually form a team of your 11 players on the app. Okay, so this is real life. You're just emulating, you're just picking up the same names and creating a team. That's it, your job is done. Now when the match starts, you can't change anything. What happens now is that whatever the real life performance is, based on that, your team gets points. So if Virat is part of your team and Virat hits a 6, you'll get 1 point, for example. Okay, or there's a great bowler, he's taken a wicket, you'll get some points. So based on the entire match, small events, single events of all the match, the points are aggregated, and towards the end of the match, your team has certain points. Now, like you, there would be thousands of other, lakhs of other people who would be doing the same thing. Okay? So your ranking amongst all of them is what makes you win or lose. That's what fantasy sports is all about. So if you can just quickly go to the next slide.
ये
I guess since I announced we are not going to do presentation, so no one is there to handle these slides. Never mind. So here it is, like I said. So some of the great things that these platforms provides you is that based on your skill and knowledge, it gives you an opportunity to actually get involved, engage in this in match. So it is just beyond watching now. You're actually playing it. You're actually challenging others who are also on the platform to do the same. Okay. It is absolutely transparent. So if there are 1 million people playing on that same day before a match, you will exactly know who's forming what team. क्या ऐसा unique उन्होंने किया अपने team में, you'll know. And finally, what happens at the end of the match? जो results आते हैं, like I said, उस basis पे आप win or lose करते हैं. So there is no simulation involved. So this is one unique sort of a platform जिसमें कोई सिमुलेशन नहीं होता है, जिसमें कोई assumptions नहीं होते, जिसमें कोई chance नहीं होता है. This is all based on real life. That's what fantasy sports is about. So today, our objective is basically to give you some interesting information on what fantasy sports is, make you aware of what fantasy sports is, and it's catching up so fast in India that today India has over 15 crore, 150 million users, and these in fact, let me tell you, it has already surpassed US market. US का user base से ज़्यादा बड़ा India का user base बन गया है fantasy sports में. And so anyway, let me start my conversation with both the gentlemen here. And Professor Shetty has been involved with BCCI for many decades. अगर आप लोग बहुत पहले क्रिकेट देख रहे हो तो इफ यू रिमेंबर सुपर सिलेक्टर करके कुछ हुआ करता था many years ago, जहां आप अपनी एक सुपर सिलेक्टर गेम टीम बना सकते थे. So sir, you have been at the helm of this cricket as well as fantasy sports for such a long time. I think it's very important for the audience to really know how this whole thing started, where it is right now, and how the whole thing has shaped up in the last few years, maybe a decade.
Well, I think there was a time when we are all cricket crazy fans in India. That is the biggest sport in India that we follow, and it was only watching matches being played on television. That is what used to happen, and somewhere along the line also. There used to be these rumors of betting and other things that used to happen, match fixing, etc. But in 2015, this was already, the fantasy sports was already existing in US markets, and NBA used to be a huge following for that. So that came about in India also, and it was cricket with which it started first basically. And what it did was actually get the people involved with the game. So instead of just watching a cricket match and getting frustrated when India doesn't do well or when your players don't do well, you start following the game yourself, be a party to the game as such at your own leisure. So these apps were started in the markets, and people started playing fantasy sports leagues. I still remember there was a time when it was free play, play for free. There was no money involved, or you don't have to pay any charges for playing that. I still remember for IPL we used to have fantasy sports introduced, where the winner used to get autographed T-shirts. There was no prize money or cash awards relating to fantasy sports. So fantasy sports, in a way, has given the people an approach to follow the game more closely, create their own team. That's why it is called fantasy. A dream team that you prepare, and you then see what happens, how your team does at the end of the match. So you are competing with others, your own friends, or a large majority of people who are playing the fantasy sports leagues. That's how the process goes on. Today it is developed into a huge game, and it helps not only cricket but all other leagues also. And I look at it as a source of increasing viewership for the sports in India.
Thank you, sir. Let me tell you one very interesting fact which is attached to fantasy sports is that fantasy sports has actually now led the consumption of sports in India. Simple reason है, because मुझे fantasy sports पे खेलना है, so मैं वो match, वो game देखना start कर दिया है. I was only a cricket fan. अब मैं football भी खेलना चाहता हूँ. तो आज football में ये team मुझे बनानी, तो I don't know the players, I don't know the game. So people have started watching football. Women's cricket has become such a huge success for fantasy sports. Kabaddi जैसी game is now on the top 3 of the game being played on fantasy sports. So it's very interesting. A lot of things are happening. Let me quickly come to Dinkar, because I'm going to ask him a very extremely important question. They are running one of the largest platforms for fantasy sports, and the biggest challenge is that fantasy sports, online gaming, gets confused with a lot of other things. And generally हम न्यूज़ में बहुत सारी रिपोर्ट्स देखते हैं, उसने इतना पैसा डाल दिया, उसका पैसा खत्म हो गया, वो सुसाइड कर दी, ये कर दी. There's so many things happening. So Dinkar, if you could share some light in terms of how do we distinguish what is right, what is wrong, what is the difference between all of this?
Thank you, Anwar. And since we are speaking at a Bhopal Literary Festival, I think it will be customary on my part to start with a quote from the Bard of Avon. When Shakespeare wrote that that what we call rose by any other name would smell as sweet. I think that was neither true in the world of Romeo and Juliet, and nor is it true in the real life, because nomenclature makes a lot of difference. And what Anwar hinted at is that everything is getting categorized under the same nomenclature. The essential nomenclature which is here at the root of the entire dispute is what is a game of skill and what is a game of chance. In the mind of India's apex jurisprudence, that is a jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, what is a game of skill is constitutionally protected as a legitimate business activity under Article 19(1)(g). And what is not a game of skill is akin to gambling, which therefore it is prohibited. Now, fantasy is clearly defined as a game of skill. It is a part of the larger games of skill family. And therefore, by repeated Supreme Court jurisprudence, it has been held that it is a legitimate business activity. However, what happens is that during media discourses, during public narratives, anything which is played for stakes or anything which is played online is construed as akin to gambling, which is not only fallacious but which is also legally untenable. And I think that differentiation, one could argue that industry has not made sufficient efforts to to articulate that distinction. Perhaps to some extent, maybe it has started to do it right now. But I think that distinction has to be effectively conveyed to policymakers, to media, as well as to civil society.
Thank you, Dinkar. And exactly from that perspective, it's extremely important to be a part of an event like this, because we can clearly see there are a lot of influencers here. So my appeal to all influencers is that now please go out and tell everybody what game of skill is and fantasy sports is. Interestingly, what also has happened in this industry, starting from, and it's been happening for decades, there have been so many court cases. But interestingly, around fantasy sports, there are over a dozen court cases in the past 5 years, which he said definitely spoke about the apex court even recognizing this. While we have all of these court cases, still the country does not have a regulation. And whether it is legal or illegal can only be defined if there is a law. Law hai to legal hai. Law nahi hai to fir kuch hai nahi. So the point, sir, I wanted to ask you is that in such a scenario, when there is an absence of regulation, the government is still grappling with what to do, how to do it, because it's not as simple as it looks. What is it that can be done to ensure that the user interest is protected, that the legitimate industry is able to grow further?
What I think people should know is that the industry itself has formed a self-regulatory body, and consumer protection is a part of that. I still remember in late 2018 when the process started to prepare rules for the industry. For example, the people less than 18 years of age should not be encouraged to play fantasy sports, or the platform should ensure that somebody is not addicted so much that he starts keeping on coming back to your platform to play. So there is also a provision for that, for the platforms to keep track of how people are playing on fantasy leagues on their platforms. There is also a counselor proposal that the platform uses to counsel the people to play the right way on their platforms. So internally the industry has taken a number of steps, and all this is actually to protect not only the youngsters who come and play these games, but also to protect the industry in the larger interest.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Dinkar, you have a point to make here.
So, it's an unfortunate fact, fortunate or it's a realistic fact that technology will always develop faster than the government does. We have seen it in multiple forms. To take some examples from the current context, e-commerce came in India the way we knew it, started in 2007-8, and we are in 2022. Right now also at the Government of India level, we have our third draft policy of e-commerce in India. We don't have a formal regulation for that. Ola and Uber started offering their operations at least 12 years ago. It took at least 9 years before before the new version of Motor Vehicle Act came out, and it started regulating them to some extent. Zomato and Swiggy, again a duopoly in food delivery business, has been in existence for now 8 years. But it was only about 2 years ago that the FSSAI came out with a formal set of regulations. Any industry you look, so the point essentially trying to make is that technology will outpace the regulation or the way government is going to think. So that doesn't mean that anything which is new, which is coming to the fore, is going to be delegitimized. The onus is of course upon the government, upon the stakeholders, upon the judiciary to ensure that laws keep pace with the technological development. Because if regulatory systems are in place, if effective regulatory procedures are in place, that facilitates the larger completely and creative destruction, which is good for the business, good for the society, and good for the larger ecosystem.
Yeah. Thanks, Dinkar. Another important thing which happened was and how the entire landscape changed of people, citizens engaging with platforms during pandemic and lockdowns. हम सब घर में बैठे थे, okay, except for आप लोग फील्ड में क्या कर रहे थे, you know it better, but for most of us, we were sitting at home and the only thing that we had to consume was something on the screen. So, sir, in such, what happened to the industry? Because I know everybody talks about gaming, सब gaming बहुत खेल रहे थे, but I think there is another side to it also.
Yeah, last 2 years were very difficult for the industry as such because fantasy sports leagues are all dependent on live games. So there were no live games, more or less all games had stopped everywhere because the pandemic had affected all over the world. And as a result, the industry, I think everybody suffered last 2 years. The only thing that happened was the IPL, which was played in UAE. So that was the breathing space that happened for the industry, I would say. But they had to depend on games which were available on television. And it was for the first time last year that new games started getting followed by people in India. For example, there's a craze for basketball being played, and people started taking interest watching and participating in fantasy sports for even basketball because there was no other choice left to them. So whatever was available, you play and follow those games.
Well, at least in the 2 years of lockdown when there were no sporting events, fantasy sports खेल ही नहीं पाए. So technically जो fantasy हो सकती थी वो fantasy नहीं हुई during lockdown. So anyway, so I think we see a lot of development now happening with respect to regulation because very recently Prime Minister announced, very clearly mentioned the intent that online gaming is a very big sector for India. It possibly is the next sunrise sector, जैसा हमारा IT हुआ, services हुआ, even online gaming को consider किया जा रहा है as the next big sector. इसमें jobs बहुत create हो रहे हैं, इसमें FDI बहुत आ रहा है, इसमें government को revenue बहुत generate हो रहा है. So there is a clear vision that Prime Minister has led now, and in fact, last couple of months there have been multiple announcements in the government saying that the direction that they want to take. Ministry of INB एक task force already बना रही हैं जिसके ऊपर इसके ऊपर deliberate किया जाएगा and possibly a good regulation will come. Similarly, Ministry of IT इसके ऊपर काम कर रही है. So I think clearly बहुत सारी ऐसी चीजें हो रही हैं जिसके कारण the industry will get that legitimate recognition that it needs. But I would urge everybody to try this once. It's extremely interesting and you'll love it. It does not consume too much time. That's the reason it is not addictive, because you have to only form a team based on knowledge. And if you think you have 50-100 rupees in your pocket and you think that you want to try how it works, try the paid format also. Okay? So with this, these were some of the things that we thought we'll speak to you. We're happy to take your questions for any three of us.
Sure.
हेलो गुड इवनिंग सर एंड थैंक यू फॉर दिस वंडरफुल डिस्कशन. मेरा क्वेश्चन जो है थोड़ा हटके है. सो मेरा क्वेश्चन है कि रिवेन्यू मॉडल क्या होता है जो फैंटेसी प्लेटफॉर्म्स होते हैं, जो ऐप्स होते हैं, व्हाट इज देयर रिवेन्यू मॉडल? लाइक डू प्लेयर्स आर आल्सो इन्वॉल्व? क्या उसमें प्लेयर्स भी कोई इन्वॉल्व होते हैं या उनमें नहीं होते?
ओके, वेरी गुड क्वेश्चन. थैंक यू फॉर आस्किंग दिस क्वेश्चन. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, प्लेयर्स इन्वॉल्व नहीं होते इसमें. ओके, बिकॉज एक रियल लाइफ मैच हो रही है, हमें पता है वहाँ कौन क्या कर रहा है, बेसिस दैट हम हमारी यहाँ टीम बनाते हैं. ओके, और रेवेन्यू मॉडल की जहाँ तक बात है, फैंटेसी स्पोर्ट्स के अंदर ऐसा होता है कि जब आप कोई कॉन्टेस्ट में एंटर करते हैं, कॉन्टेस्ट बेसिकली होती है जैसा कुछ लोग मिलके एक पर्टिकुलर मैच के साथ एंगेज होना चाह रहे हैं. सो जैसा मैंने दिल्ली मुंबई का एग्जाम्पल लिया, वही एग्जाम्पल लेता हूँ. दिल्ली मुंबई मैच होने वाली है, जैसा आपको इंटरेस्ट है उसके अंदर कॉन्टेस्ट में एंटर करना, किसी और को भी होगा, ऐसे काफ़ी लोगों को होगा, वो सब फ्री तो ऐसे खेल ही सकते हैं, बट अगर उनको पे करके खेलना है तो दे पे एन एक्स अमाउंट, लेट्स कंसिडर दैट एज 100 रुपीज़। वो 100 रुपीज़ में से 80% गोज इनटू अ ट्रस्ट अकाउंट विच इज कॉल्ड एज प्राइस पूल, और ओनली 20% जो होता है उसमें से 18 to 20% इज व्हाट दीज प्लेटफॉर्म्स कीप एज कॉल्ड एज प्लेटफॉर्म फी। ओके, वो जो 80% है वो पूरा डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हो जाता है अमंग्स्ट दी winners, and winner is not one, there are winners. Almost 50% of the people who participated in a particular contest, हो सकता है contest 1000 लोग का हो, 1 लाख लोग का हो, 50% को पूरा अमाउंट डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हो जाता है।
सर इफ यू अलाउ वन मोर, इसमें एक क्वेश्चन है कि जो इसमें हमारा अभी तक कोई रेगुलेशन तो है नहीं इसमें गवर्नमेंट की, सो व्हाट आर द टैक्सेस द प्लेटफॉर्म्स पे टू द गवर्नमेंट, डू दे पे एनी टैक्सेस और दे?
सो टैक्सेस और रेगुलेशन का मैं आपको बता दूं थोड़ा डिफरेंस होता है कि रेगुलेशन हो ना हो, टैक्स के लिए हमेशा यूजुअली स्ट्रक्चर्स अवेलेबल होते हैं। तो ये पर्टिकुलर इंडस्ट्री एक ऑनलाइन कंटेंट की कैटेगरी में आती है जिसका ऑलरेडी जीएसटी के अंदर बहुत क्लियरली डिफाइंड है कितना टैक्स भरना है, तो उसका टैक्स उतना भरा जाता है, पहली बात। दूसरी बात, दूसरे टैक्सेस भी होते हैं, विनिंग्स, जैसा सपोज आपने 100 रुपीज़ डाले और आपने 1000 रुपये जीत लिए फॉर एग्जांपल, तो आपको जब पे आउट्स होते हैं उसके अंदर भी टीडीएस के रूल्स बहुत क्लियर है, तो पे आउट्स के अंदर टीडीएस भी कटा जाता है। तो टैक्सेस इज समथिंग विच द इंडस्ट्री इज वेरी कंप्लायंट, और चूंकि इंडस्ट्री कम्प्लीटली ऑनलाइन है सो यहाँ तो कुछ हिडन हो ही नहीं सकता, एवरीथिंग इज ऑडिटेबल।
I have a question, Anwar.
सर
You said that in the last 2 years there hasn't been so much activity. You know, you are an app, and I mean, there's a lot of mathematical science involved, statistical science. So if I'm a statistical genius, I think I'll do very well in it. Unfortunately, I'm not. But why did you find that the level of involvement of people in this sport was less in the last 2 years because of COVID? I mean, how did COVID, what is the correlation between the two?
It is not the last 2 years and it is not COVID. I said 2 years of lockdown. Because world over there were lockdowns, there were no sporting events. And when there is no sporting event...
Okay, so there's no live event, then this doesn't...
So if there is no live event, you can't play on
So why don't you call yourself a derivative?
Very interesting. It is a derivative actually, but it cannot be called
Because there is an underlying platform, there is an underlying sport. You are only a...
The only issue is that it's always been called as fantasy sports, and this is something not that we devised.
So I personally feel that, you know, pardon my speaking without a mic, but I think some of the misconception is because of the fact that you're fantasy.
Absolutely right.
If you had called yourself fantasy science and put a small thing, you know, fantasy science instead of fantasy sports, things would have perhaps been, you know, easier.
Just one particular point which you said, and you know, it sounded music to my ears when you said that, you know, excellence at this particular game required statistical finesse, and that is actually the, you know, that is something which is the essence of all skill gaming. In fact, the Indian School of Business, which happens to be my alma mater as well, it ran a very detailed study on a different game of skill, which is the Rummy, online Rummy. And there, you know, and it was the study was led by their statistics professor, and in consultation with Deloitte, and it showed that, you know, Rummy when played with seriousness is a game of skill. Similarly, for fantasy, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology ran again a detailed statistical study which said that fantasy is a game of skill, it cannot be dependent upon chance.
So no, the point I'm trying to make is perhaps you should consider, and this is just a layman's suggestion and you guys deal with it morning to night and so you're more involved with it, the word science somewhere.
Point well taken, sir.
Science of fantasy sports, or, you know, I mean, somewhere you must bring that into your branding.
Sure.
Just a suggestion.
Coming from you, definitely it carries a lot of weight. Thank you for that suggestion.
We might have to take at best one question more because the cruise is waiting for us.
One last question.
Sir, good evening, sir. I just wanted to ask, when you have a future of fantasy sports, metaverse, blockchain, why not create a virtual thing? We have fantasy, we have virtual sports. We connected with fantasy platforms. Even in the United States, there are sports named as pillow fighting that are more popular than the NBA. That is gaining more money than the NBA. Pillow fighting is something people would enjoy. You do it at home, but when you do it in the ring, it's actually becoming more of an entertainment. So why in India we should not go with sports like that, or slab fighting are there? These are some sports that earn more revenue than the NBA.
I couldn't get your name, please.
Sir, Ekas Singh, Ekas.
Because so that's a very relevant question, and that's a great suggestion. So I think what you're suggesting is that there should be an overall development and proliferation of gaming ecosystem in India. That is something which Honorable Prime Minister has also hinted towards, and that is perhaps at the heart of the Finance Minister in her last budget speech also announcing that she'll set up an ABGC task force. So that's there. But I think before that to happen, we need to clearly define in our minds that we cannot de-hyphenate certain games from that. We cannot say that certain games are bad and certain games are good. For the larger gaming ecosystem to flourish, I think we need the support to the overall sector.
And if I can just supplement a little bit with one sentence to close the evening, is in the entire online gaming space, there are many things happening. Fantasy sports is there, esports is there, cards and dice games are there, casual games are there, and I'm sure I'm missing out something. Quizzes are there. So the whole space is developing, and you should join some gaming company. Your suggestions are required more by the gaming company, because metaverse and all that. Let me tell you, AI, ML, metaverse, these are the technologies that these companies have already started adopting.
Connected with a metaverse company and just helping with their branding and some marketing schemes. It's called Loka. It was featured in the Shark Tank India too. So I had a conversation with the founder when actually we had a game of boxing at the Loka. Like we have a boxing, the one who gets it gets more discounts on Decathlon, or he gets a free merchandise of Decathlon or free products worth of Nike. So this is something that we can relate to. Rather than betting it, getting into money, rather than making it more type of gambling, we can make it like more of giving gifts or giving merchandises or something like that to them. That's what that's it.
And for you to start a platform.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for that wonderful conversation. जोरदार तालियां होनी चाहिए इतनी insightful discussion के लिए. Thank you so much, Anwar जी, रत्नाकर जी and दिनकर जी. मैं इनवाइट करना चाहूँगा राघव चंद्रा सर को. मैं रिक्वेस्ट करूँगा कि वो मंच पे आएँ एंड फेलिसिटेट करें हमारे ऑथर एंड हमारे डिस्कशंस को with a beautiful painting and some beautiful mugs we have here. A painting, as I previously said, as I previously mentioned, a beautiful tribal art created by Padma Shri Bhauri Bhai ji. A beautiful art as a symbol of love, respect and gratitude from the Society for Culture and Environment. And of course our wonderful discussants, Ratnagar ji or Dinkar ji.
We got started. Could have,
Indeed, it was an interesting discussion. Certainly, fantasy sports is something which is going to be crucial in the future.